I am Susan, 68 years old, and until yesterday, I believed I still had a family. I was folding my new sundresses into a suitcase for a luxury family cruise when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from my son, Christopher. "You're not joining the cruise. My wife wants just family." I stood there in the small guest cottage on the property I still legally owned, reading those words over and over. I did not cry. I did not call him. I simply zipped the suitcase back up, sat down at my kitchen table, and started making calls of my own. By the next afternoon, the house he thought was safely his was already listed for sale. Before I go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you have ever been pushed aside by the very people you built a life for, hit that subscribe button because this story is for you. The morning had started so normally. Soft light was coming through the curtains of the guest cottage, falling across the small wooden table where I kept a photo of my late husband, Walter. I had been up since 5, carefully rolling my clothes the way Walter taught me, fitting everything into one modest suitcase for the 10-day Caribbean cruise. This trip was supposed to matter. It was supposed to be the moment my son and I finally found our footing again after years of distance that his wife had quietly built between us. I had even bought a new sun hat and a light blue dress for the formal dinner night, the kind of small, hopeful purchase a mother makes when she still believes there is a chance to be close to her child again. I was smoothing the wrinkles out of that dress when my phone lit up on the nightstand. I expected it to be Christopher telling me the car was packed and it was time to head to the port. Instead, I read that short, cold message. "You are not joining the cruise. My wife wants just family." I read it 3 times. I took my glasses off, rubbed my eyes, and put them back on to read it a 4th time, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something kinder. They did not change. There was no apology attached. There was no phone call to soften the blow, just a flat, cowardly text sent on the very morning we were supposed to leave. I looked around the small guest cottage that had become my whole world. It sat behind the large main house on the same acre of land Walter and I had bought decades earlier, back when this street was just a quiet dirt road with a handful of homes. I had moved into this cottage 3 years ago, right after Walter passed, so that Christopher and his wife could settle into the big house and start their life together in comfort. I told myself I was giving them room to grow. I told myself it was what a good mother does. I had given them privacy. I had given them space. I had given them nearly everything, and in return I was being erased from a family vacation through a text message because I did not fit the picture his wife wanted to paint for her side of the family. A cold feeling settled into my chest, but it was not sadness. It was something sharper. It was clarity. I did not text him back. I did not call to ask why. I stood up, walked to my suitcase, and unzipped it. One by one, I lifted out the sundresses, the sun hat, the light blue dinner dress, and laid them gently on the bed. The vacation was over before it began, but something else in me was just waking up. I walked to the small desk in the corner of my living room and opened my laptop. Christopher and his wife, Danielle, had always believed I was just a retired schoolteacher living on a small pension, quietly getting by in the cottage because I could not afford anything better. They treated me with a kind of soft, careless pity, the kind you show someone you assume has nothing left to offer. They did not know the truth. Walter and I had spent 30 years building a small trucking and logistics company from a single-use delivery van. We worked nights. We skipped vacations. We built something real, piece by piece, until it became a company serving half the state. When Walter got sick, we sold the majority of the business, and the money that came from it meant I would never have to worry about a single bill for the rest of my life. We had chosen, together, to keep that part of our life quiet from Christopher. We wanted him to build his own confidence, his own work ethic, instead of leaning on money that was not his. But then he met Danielle, a woman whose entire identity seemed to be built around designer labels, expensive vacations, and the approval of her wealthy parents. I watched my gentle son slowly turn into someone anxious, someone constantly chasing a lifestyle he could not actually afford. I opened my banking portal. The screen loaded, showing account balances that would have shocked my son had he ever bothered to ask. I clicked over to the shared credit card I had quietly used to help pay for parts of this cruise. 2 months earlier, Christopher had come to me nearly in tears, worried about how they would afford the VIP suite Danielle wanted so her parents could join them. Out of old habit, out of love I had never learned to turn off, I had quietly covered the $22,000 balance for their suite. I found the pending charge still sitting in the system. With one click, I reversed the payment and filed a dispute for services no longer needed. But I was not finished. I opened the recurring payments tab. Every month, an automatic transfer from my account covered the lease on Christopher's pickup truck, the one Danielle insisted made him look successful. Cancelled. Next was the automatic payment for Daniela's premium gym and wellness membership, the one she swore she absolutely needed but never once offered to pay for herself. Cancelled. I watched each confirmation screen appear, one after another. I was quietly taking down the invisible safety net I had built under them for years. They wanted a family vacation that did not include me. I was simply giving them exactly what they asked for. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see straight into the driveway of the main house. The front door swung open, and Christopher stepped out carrying 2 large suitcases. Danielle followed behind him, laughing into her phone, wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than my first car. I stood quietly in the shadow of the cottage and watched my son. I waited for him to glance toward my window. I waited for one small flicker of guilt, maybe even a quick knock on my door to soften the blow face to face. He never turned his head. He loaded the bags into the trunk, slammed it shut, and shared a laugh with Danielle as if the morning were already perfect. They were excited. They were leaving the old woman behind so they could enjoy a luxury vacation paid for, in large part, with my quiet generosity. The engine started. Danielle waved cheerfully to her parents, who had just pulled into the driveway behind them in a separate car. Both vehicles backed out slowly, turned onto the quiet street, and disappeared. The laughter faded. The sound of engines vanished. The property fell into a deep, hollow silence. I took a long breath and let the last bit of guilt I had been carrying simply drift away. I turned from the window, picked up my phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a calm, steady voice answered. "Diane," I said, speaking to my longtime attorney and friend. "I need you to start the trust restructuring we talked about last year." "Yes, all of it. And I need a formal notice prepared for Christopher. I am done funding a life that has no room for me in it." 2 hours later, a silver car pulled into the driveway. Patricia, the sharpest real estate broker in the county, stepped out holding a leather folder under her arm. I met her outside and walked her through the main house. The place was a mess. Dirty dishes sat piled in the sink. Damp towels were tossed carelessly over the expensive furniture. Unopened mail was stacked high on the dining table. It was the physical picture of entitlement, room after room. Patricia looked around with the calm, practiced eye of someone who already understood the value sitting under her feet. Developers had been circling this neighborhood for years, eager to tear down older homes and build modern estates in their place. "I do not want to wait," I told her, standing in the middle of that cluttered living room. "I want a fast, all-cash sale. I am not chasing the highest number. I want speed. I want someone who can close before the week is over." Patricia smiled, the kind of smile that told me she already had buyers in mind.
"Consider it done, Susan," she said.
"I have developers who will move on a property like this in days, not weeks." She placed the listing agreement on the kitchen counter. I signed my name without hesitation. We walked back to the cottage together, where I gathered a small leather bag holding my passport, my financial records, and the folder of trust documents Diane had prepared years earlier, just in case this day ever came. I took the heavy set of keys off my key ring, the ones to the main house and the cottage, and walked them back into the kitchen. I placed them gently in the center of the counter, right beside a stack of unpaid parking tickets addressed to Christopher. The soft metal clink echoed through the empty house. I locked the door on my way out, handed the spare key to Patricia, and got into my car. The highway stretched ahead of me, long and gray under the afternoon sun. For the first time in years, I rolled the windows down just to feel the wind on my face. I merged into traffic and let the car settle into a steady, easy pace. I felt lighter than I had in years. I had left the keys behind. I had signed the papers. I was no longer a guest in my own life. I was simply a woman driving forward. Then my phone began to buzz against the passenger seat. It buzzed once, then again, then it did not stop. I did not reach for it right away. I let it rattle against the leather seat while I kept my eyes on the road, because I already knew exactly where my son was standing, and I already knew exactly what was happening to him. Right about now, Christopher and Danielle were standing at the terminal for the cruise line, surrounded by the smell of salt water and expensive perfume. I could picture it clearly. The massive white ship rising over the dock. The VIP boarding line. Danielle in her resort dress, holding a designer bag that likely cost more than my first delivery van. And standing right beside them, Daniela's parents. Daniela's parents were the kind of people who measured worth in appearances. They had built their comfortable life on inherited money and never let anyone forget it. When Christopher married into that family, he married their expectations along with her. He bought things he could not afford. He said yes to trips he could not pay for. He had promised them all a flawless luxury cruise, the kind that would finally prove he belonged in their world. My phone stopped buzzing for a moment, then it began to ring. Christopher's name flashed on the screen, a photo from his wedding day, back when his smile still looked easy and unguarded. I let it ring. The call went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, a flood of text messages began pouring in. I finally pulled over into a small rest stop just off the highway. I put the car in park and picked up the phone. The messages were frantic. The first said the ticketing agent could not find their cruise reservation. The second said the payment had been declined. The third demanded I call the bank immediately to fix what he assumed was some kind of error. A bank error. That is what he actually believed. It never crossed his mind that his own mother had simply said no. He had grown so used to my quiet financial support running in the background of his life that he could not imagine a version of me that finally stopped giving. I read the next message. Mom, you need to call the bank right now. Daniela's parents are standing right here. Everyone is watching. Fix this. I sat quietly in my car and pictured him at that counter, sweating, checking his wallet for a card that could cover the difference, knowing there was none. Danielle would be tapping her foot, glancing around to see who might be watching her humiliation. Her mother would be whispering something sharp under her breath. Her father would be staring at Christopher with quiet disgust. The pressure on my son in that moment would be crushing. He was standing in front of the people he admired most, being exposed as someone who could not actually provide the life he had promised them. Another message came through. Mom, please pick up. They're going to give away our suite. Do you understand how embarrassing this is for me? I stared at those words for a long time. Do you understand how embarrassing this is for me?
Not a single word about me.
Not one question about why I had done this. Just his own image, his own comfort, his own fear of losing face in front of strangers who only respected him for what he could buy them. For one brief moment, that old motherly instinct rose up in my chest, the urge to fix everything, to protect him from pain the way I always had. For 30 years, I had stepped in whenever life got hard for him. When he wrecked his first car, I bought him another. When he failed a semester of college, I quietly paid to keep him enrolled. When he wanted a bigger house than he could afford, I handed him mine and moved into the cottage. I had spent my whole life shielding him from consequences. And what had that protection built? A grown man who would erase his own mother with a text message just to please a wife who never respected either of us. I looked at the screen again. Fix this. Not a request. An order. From a son who had come to believe I existed purely to serve him. I took a slow breath. The air inside the car felt different now, lighter, entirely my own. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger requires you to still expect something from someone. I had no expectations left. I only had a quiet, steady clarity. I did not answer his messages. I did not call to explain myself. He did not need an explanation. He had already told me exactly where I stood when he said his wife wanted just family. I was simply honoring the boundary he had drawn for me. I opened his contact page on my phone and looked at his name one last time. I remembered him as a little boy holding my hand at the park. I remembered teaching him to drive in an empty parking lot on Sunday mornings. Then I remembered the text message from that morning, dismissing me like an inconvenience. I scrolled down and pressed block. A small message appeared, asking if I was sure I wanted to stop receiving calls and texts from this contact. I pressed confirm. Just like that, the connection was severed. The buzzing stopped. The frantic messages vanished. The screen went dark, and the inside of my car filled with a quiet, almost peaceful silence. I set the phone in the cup holder and looked out at the road ahead. The sky was wide and clear. There were no more demands weighing on me. No more guilt. No more shrinking myself to keep the peace with people who looked down on me. I put the car back in drive and merged onto the highway, heading south along the coast, leaving all of it behind. If you are still with me, drop a heart in the comments, because things are about to get a lot more interesting for Christopher. I found a small, quiet motel overlooking the water and checked in for a few nights. It was simple and unremarkable, exactly what I needed. I carried my leather bag inside, set my laptop on the small desk by the window, and connected to the internet. Within minutes, my phone rang. It was Patricia. Patricia never called just to chat. She only called with results. She told me she already had 3 offers on the house, all from developers eager to move fast. I was not surprised. To Christopher and Danielle, that house had simply been a comfortable place to live without responsibility. To the rest of the world, it was valuable land in a rapidly growing neighborhood. Walter and I had bought that property 30 years ago, back when it was just a quiet, forgotten street. Over the last decade, new offices and shops had moved in nearby, and our old street had quietly become one of the most desirable blocks in the county. For years, I had thrown away the postcards from developers offering cash for the land. I wanted Christopher to inherit a real home, not just a plot of dirt to sell. Patricia told me the top offer came from a company called Meridian Development. They wanted a clean, immediate cash sale. No waiting periods, no inspections, no delays. I told her to accept it. Over the next 2 days, my small motel room became the center of a quiet legal storm. I sat by the window, watching the waves roll in while I signed document after document. Title transfers, wire authorizations, seller disclosures. I read every page carefully, but my hand never once hesitated over the signature line. Somewhere out on the ocean, my son had no idea that the ground beneath the house he assumed was still his was being sold out from under him. On Friday morning, the final email arrived. The subject line read simply, "Transaction complete." I opened my banking app to confirm. The number staring back at me was almost unbelievable, though the money itself was never really the point. It was proof. Proof that the deed was done. The house belonged to Meridian Development now, and it was no longer my son's safety net. Let me tell you something about selling the home you raised your child in. You expect to feel a wave of grief. You expect the old memories to reach out and make you hesitate. But when the betrayal comes from your own child, something changes. The sentimental value of wood and brick simply falls away, and what is left is relief. I thought about the guest cottage, where I had quietly tucked myself away so they could have the big house all to themselves. I thought about how I was slowly made to feel like a visitor in my own family, someone who did not quite belong in the pictures Danielle wanted to post online. I had paid the property taxes. I had paid for repairs. I had paid the bills for a house I was barely welcome to walk through. The developers could tear it all down if they wanted. I welcomed it. I wanted every trace of that curated, entitled little world wiped away completely. Patricia called one final time to confirm everything was closed. She told me the developers wanted to take possession as quickly as possible. I told her to hand over the keys immediately. Sitting in that motel room, watching the sunset paint the sky orange over the water, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not because of the money sitting quietly in my account, but because for the first time in a very long time, I belonged to myself again. I had taken my life back from people who only ever saw me as something to be used. The trap was set. The house was gone. All that remained now was for the ship to bring my son home. I already knew what was likely happening at that terminal, even from hundreds of miles away. When you spend 30 years cleaning up someone else's messes, you learn to predict their exact patterns of panic. I could picture Christopher standing at the front desk, watching the agent swipe the canceled card and calmly explain the balance was unpaid. $22,000 is not a number you casually wave away as a simple mistake. It is a number that stops everyone in line behind you. Danielle would freeze in her expensive sandals. Her parents, expecting a flawless trip, would stare at Christopher with quiet disgust. To people like them, there is no greater failure than looking poor in public. Christopher had a choice in that moment. A confident man would have pulled his wife aside, admitted the truth, and calmly canceled the trip with his dignity intact. But Christopher did not have that kind of strength because I had gently taken it from him years earlier, every single time I stepped in and caught him before he could fall. So he did what a desperate man always does. He reached for his wallet and started pulling out cards. I knew his financial situation better than he did. He kept a few personal credit cards hidden from Danielle, the dangerous kind, with interest rates that only make sense when you are truly out of options. He would have handed the first card over with a shaking hand, watched it approve a few $1,000s before maxing out completely. Then the second card. Then the third, draining every last bit of available credit just to clear the screen. By splitting that bill across 3 high-interest cards, he had just guaranteed himself years of debt. And that amount only covered getting through the doors. It did not cover the nightly dinners Danielle expected. It did not cover the spa visits or the excursions she had already booked in her head. He was walking onto a floating paradise, but for him, it was about to become something else entirely. Every time Danielle ordered a fancy drink by the pool, Christopher was going to feel his chest tighten. Every time her parents suggested an expensive bottle of wine, he was going to quietly calculate how much closer he was to financial ruin. The luxury trip he had insisted on taking without me had just become a trap he tied around his own neck. I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the birds drift over the water outside my window. There is a very particular kind of peace that comes when you finally stop trying to control what was never yours to control. For years, I had lost sleep worrying about his choices, his debts, his desperate need to impress people who did not truly care about him. I had tried to give him a strong foundation so he would never have to struggle the way Walter and I once did. But you cannot build a strong foundation under someone who only wants to build a house of cards. The ship was likely sounding its departure horn right about now. And somewhere on that deck, my son was smiling for photos while quietly suffocating underneath the surface. He had chosen appearances over honesty. He had chosen an illusion over the truth. Now he was going to get exactly what he asked for. Surrounded by people and entirely alone. The drive down the coast eventually brought me exactly where I always intended to end up. I turned off the main highway onto a quiet gated road lined with palm trees. The security guard recognized my car and waved me through with a polite nod. I parked underground in a sleek glass building overlooking the ocean and sat in the car for a moment, simply enjoying the quiet. This was not the tense, careful silence of the guest cottage, where I always felt like I was disturbing someone. This was something deeper, something that felt like peace. I gathered my things and took the private elevator up to the top floor. When the doors opened, I stepped into my own small foyer and unlocked the front door. Late afternoon light poured across the hardwood floors of a home Christopher and Danielle had no idea even existed. Only Diane and Patricia knew about this place. I had bought this condo 5 years earlier, not long after handing the main house over to my son. I had convinced myself that moving into the cottage was the generous, loving thing to do. But within a few months, I understood the truth. I had not given them a home. I had given them a stage. Danielle immediately began redecorating, tossing out pieces of furniture Walter and I had bought when we were first starting our business, back when every dollar mattered. I watched pieces of my history get thrown into a dumpster to make room for imported marble and expensive glass tables. It broke my heart, but I never said a word. Instead, quietly, I took a small portion of what Walter and I had built together and bought this condo in cash. I told myself it was simply a smart investment. But somewhere deep down, I already knew I was building a lifeboat because I could already feel my son tying himself to an anchor. I unpacked slowly in the master bedroom, hanging up the little I had brought with me. I had left decades of belongings behind at the old house, and I found I genuinely did not care. The things that truly mattered were never the furniture. They were peace and freedom from being made to feel small. I walked into the small home office, opened my laptop, and checked my email one more time. A final confirmation had arrived from the escrow company. The wire transfer for the house had fully cleared. The money was resting safely in an account with my name on it, completely untouchable by anyone who shared my last name. I closed the laptop, poured myself a small glass of wine, and stepped out onto the balcony. The ocean breeze hit my face, carrying the clean scent of salt and freedom. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Somewhere out there, far across the water, my son was sailing further and further into a financial storm of his own making. I took a slow sip of wine and watched the sun disappear below the horizon. My new life had officially begun. If this story is pulling you in, make sure you are subscribed, because what happens next to Christopher and Danielle is something you do not want to miss. Days passed aboard that ship in a blur of quiet panic for Christopher. The ship ran entirely on a cashless system. Every meal, every drink, every excursion charged directly to their room, which was tied to a card holding almost nothing. Danielle, completely unaware of the danger, spent an afternoon inside the ship's glamorous shopping promenade with her mother, admiring a diamond bracelet in a jewelry case. Her father stood nearby, scrolling through his phone, bored and detached. Danielle pointed through the glass at a pair of pearl earrings and asked if they were not the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Her mother smiled and said a woman needed proper jewelry for the formal dinner that evening. She called it the perfect welcome aboard gift. Christopher felt the blood drain from his face when he saw the price tag. He tried to gently suggest they wait, maybe look somewhere less expensive later. But before he could finish the sentence, Danielle had already handed her card to the clerk. The machine beeped sharply. Declined. The clerk tried again.
Declined a second time.
He quietly explained that the account on file needed an alternate form of payment. Danielle froze, her hand still hovering over the counter. She turned slowly and looked at Christopher, her eyes narrowing with confusion and rising anger. Her mother let out a small, theatrical sigh, the kind meant to be heard by everyone nearby. Christopher stammered something about a fraud alert, pulled out his personal credit card, and handed it over, silently praying the terminal was simply broken. It was not.
Declined.
He handed over his emergency card, the one with the terrible interest rate. Declined again. The silence in that store was suffocating. Daniela's mother finally stepped forward, opened her own designer purse, and placed her card on the counter without a word. She told the clerk to put the earrings on her account. Then she turned to Christopher and said quietly that some men simply like to play pretend and that they were used to taking care of their daughter. Her father did not even look up from his phone. He simply shook his head and walked out of the store. That evening at dinner, the humiliation continued. Daniela's father raised his wine glass in a toast to family and to men who understand real responsibility. He looked directly at Christopher while he said it. Christopher pushed his chair back and walked out of the dining room, barely holding himself together. He found a quiet spot near the railing on the outer deck, the wind whipping against his face. He needed air.
He needed a plan.
Then a memory hit him like a wave. Years earlier, I had opened a small joint emergency savings account for him right after he graduated college. I had told him clearly, this money is only for a true emergency. He had completely forgotten about it because he had never truly needed it before. I had always simply paid for things directly. His hands shook as he opened his banking app on the ship's expensive satellite internet, praying for a lifeline. He scrolled past his checking account, past his 3 maxed-out cards, searching for that old joint account. It was gone. Panic tightened around his chest. He called the bank's international support line and waited, pacing the deck. When a representative finally answered, he frantically asked about the missing account. She checked, then explained gently that the primary holder, Susan Miller, had visited a branch in person the day before and formally closed the joint account, withdrawing all funds and removing his name entirely. Christopher stood frozen, gripping the railing, the ocean roaring beneath him. His mother had not simply canceled a card. She had quietly and deliberately erased him from her financial life completely. There was no safety net left. There was no backup plan. He was stranded in the middle of the sea, completely broke and entirely alone. Monday morning arrived on my balcony with a clear blue sky and a warm breeze. I was sipping coffee when Patricia called with the final update. The developers had officially taken possession of the property at exactly 8 that morning. Because Christopher and Danielle had never signed a formal lease and never paid a single dollar in rent, they had absolutely no tenant rights under the law. In the eyes of the system, they were simply guests of the property owner, and the property owner was now a company with lawyers and a demolition schedule to keep. Patricia described the crew that arrived that morning, workers in safety vests who cut through the old locks I had installed decades earlier. A commercial moving company packed away every single item Danielle had spent years curating: the imported rugs, the designer clothing, the expensive kitchen gadgets, stuffing it all into plain cardboard boxes. Everything was loaded into a moving truck and taken to a mid-sized storage unit on the edge of town. The developer prepaid 30 days of rent as their only legal obligation, then mailed the storage key and paperwork to an address no one currently lived at. Back at the house, the crew wrapped heavy chain-link fencing around the entire property and bolted thick padlocks onto the doors. A large sign was planted in the front yard, announcing the site as an active demolition zone, warning against trespassing. By early afternoon, the home where Christopher had spent the last 3 years living rent-free was completely unrecognizable, an empty shell waiting for a wrecking ball. I sat quietly with my coffee and felt a deep, calm satisfaction settle into my chest. They had left for a luxury cruise expecting to return to a safe, comfortable sanctuary. They had no idea the real world was already waiting for them, locked behind a cheap metal door with a 30-day countdown ticking away. Later that morning, a notification arrived from the auto leasing company confirming that Christopher's truck had been officially repossessed. The leasing company had required a large down payment and strong credit when he first got the vehicle, neither of which he actually had. I had co-signed the lease and quietly covered the payments every month, another brick in the false foundation I had helped build under him. When I canceled that automatic transfer, the system reacted with cold precision. The truck had been sitting in the cruise terminal parking garage, its location tracked at all times. A recovery agency dispatched a tow truck straight to the port. Security simply reviewed the legal paperwork and waved them through. In minutes, the truck was lifted quietly onto the back of the tow truck and driven away to an impound lot, while my son sat somewhere out at sea, unaware that the one thing he thought was still waiting for him back home was already gone. If you have ever had to protect your own peace by letting someone face their own consequences, tell me in the comments, because Susan is only just getting started. Danielle, overwhelmed by the growing tension with her parents, sought comfort the only way she knew how, retreating to the ship's luxury spa for a full day of pampering. She had convinced Christopher years earlier that she needed a premium wellness insurance plan covering elite spa treatments, and he had begged me to help cover the cost every month. I had, without complaint, until the same morning I canceled everything else. She walked out of her treatment wrapped in a plush robe, feeling perfectly relaxed, and handed her insurance card to the receptionist without a second thought. The card declined. She insisted they try again. It declined a second time. A manager was called, who calmly explained that the policy had been fully canceled and no longer existed. Danielle felt her face flush with anger and panic. The bill was well over $1,000, and she had absolutely no way to pay it, since Christopher's cards were already maxed out. She had no choice but to swallow her pride and call her father. He arrived with a face made entirely of stone, quietly paid the bill without a word to the staff, then turned a cold, furious look toward his daughter. When Christopher arrived moments later, breathless and sweating, the confrontation that followed was quiet but brutal. Her father asked him plainly what kind of man brings his family on a luxury vacation with no working card and no insurance to fall back on. Christopher tried to blame a bank error again, but no one believed him anymore. The illusion had completely collapsed. And then Danielle turned on him too, accusing him of ruining her life, of humiliating her in front of the only people whose approval she had ever truly wanted. I sat on my balcony that evening, watching the stars begin to appear, and felt nothing but quiet peace. I felt no urge to fix anything for him. For 30 years, I had been his generator, quietly keeping his life running smoothly, no matter the cost to myself. But you cannot fully appreciate light until you have been forced to sit in complete darkness for a while. He chose his path. Now he had to survive it on his own. The 10-day cruise finally ended, the ship docking early one morning right on schedule. I knew because I had originally booked the trip myself. Christopher, Danielle, and her parents stepped off that ship in complete misery, their final days ruined by mounting tension and financial panic. They dragged their own bags through customs because Christopher could no longer afford to tip a porter. Exhausted and sweating in the tropical heat, Christopher clung to one small hope, that once he made it to the parking garage, he could simply unlock his truck and drive them all home to safety. He led them to the spot where he remembered parking. He pressed the button on his key fob. Nothing happened. No familiar chirp, no flashing lights, just an empty stretch of stained concrete where his truck used to be. He pressed the button again and again, panic rising in his chest. He jogged up and down the rows, certain he had simply forgotten the exact spot. Danielle crossed her arms, demanding to know what was taking so long. Her father let out a heavy, disgusted sigh. Christopher finally called port security to report a stolen vehicle. The guard checked the license plate and calmly explained the truth. The vehicle had not been stolen. It had been legally repossessed on the very first day of the cruise, after the primary account holder canceled the financial guarantee. Christopher dropped his phone. The blood drained completely from his face. He stood there in a dirty parking garage, surrounded by a furious wife and deeply disappointed in-laws, with no car, no working credit, and absolutely no way to hide the truth any longer. Daniela's father, unwilling to be seen stranded, called for an expensive ride share, deliberately leaving Christopher standing off to the side, treated as if he were invisible. They eventually all piled into the vehicle together, and the long, silent ride back toward the old neighborhood began. Christopher stared out the window the entire way, still clinging to one final hope, that at the very least, he still had a home to walk into. He had absolutely no idea that a much bigger shock was still waiting for him. If you are still watching, I want you to imagine what he saw next. Comment the word "ready" if you think you know what is coming. The car finally turned onto the familiar tree-lined street. Christopher looked out the window, and for a moment his mind simply refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The house was still there, technically, but the front yard he remembered was gone. In its place stood a tall chain-link fence wrapped tightly around the entire property, with a large sign planted in the dirt announcing the land now belonged to Meridian Development, marked clearly as an active demolition site. The driver unloaded their bags onto the sidewalk quickly, eager to get away from the tense atmosphere in his car. Danielle stepped out first and simply stared, frozen, at the fence. Her parents stepped out behind her, and her father let out a long breath of pure disgust, looking at Christopher as though he were something unpleasant stuck to his shoe. Christopher stumbled toward the fence and gripped the metal links, staring through them at the front door, now wrapped tightly in heavy chains and a thick padlock. Danielle turned to him, her voice rising into a scream that echoed down the quiet street. She demanded to know what he had done, whether he had secretly sold her home, whether they were now completely homeless. Christopher shook his head desperately, insisting there had been some terrible mistake, that his mother owned this house and would never let something like this happen. He begged for a few minutes to sort it out. Her father stepped forward, his voice cold and final. He told Christopher he was a complete failure of a man, and that successful people do not return from a luxury vacation to find their home barricaded behind a demolition fence. He turned to Danielle and told her to grab her things, because they were leaving immediately, and that Christopher was absolutely not welcome to come with them. Danielle agreed instantly. She told him she was disgusted by him, that he had ruined her life and embarrassed her for the very last time. She turned her back and walked away with her parents toward the street, leaving Christopher standing completely alone at the fence. In a moment of pure panic, he climbed over the fence, tearing his shirt on the sharp metal edges, and ran toward the front porch, desperately trying his old key in a lock that had already been drilled out and destroyed. He grabbed a large decorative rock from the garden bed and struck the heavy padlock again and again, sobbing, completely consumed by denial. What he did not know was that the property now had a silent security system installed. The moment that rock struck the padlock, a signal was sent directly to a private security company, who immediately alerted the local police of a break in progress. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived, lights flashing. Christopher, exhausted and desperate, actually felt a flicker of relief when he saw them, certain they were there to help him. They were not. The lead officer calmly explained that according to the property records, the home belonged entirely to Meridian Development, following a completed and legal sale. Christopher argued desperately that this was impossible, that his mother owned the house, that they needed to check the guest cottage where she supposedly still lived. A security guard from the development company stepped forward and explained plainly that the previous owner, Susan Miller, had completed a clean cash sale days earlier and that the property, including the guest cottage, was entirely vacated and empty. Christopher argued that even if the house had been sold, he still had rights as a tenant of 3 years. The officer checked his paperwork and explained, calmly and clearly, that because Christopher had never signed a lease and never paid a single dollar in rent or utilities, he held no legal tenant status whatsoever. He had simply been a guest of the previous owner, and those privileges ended the moment the home was sold. The refusal to sign a lease, something Danielle had once called insulting to even suggest, had just stripped him of every legal protection he could have had. The officer informed him he was currently trespassing on private property and gave him 60 seconds to climb back over the fence before he would be arrested. Christopher did not argue. He climbed back over, dropping onto the sidewalk in complete defeat, stripped entirely of his pride and his illusions. A private security guard walked over to the fence one final time. He pulled a thick envelope from his vest, with Christopher's name written across the front, and slid it through a gap in the fence without a word, letting it fall onto the sidewalk before turning and walking away. Christopher opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single silver key, along with formal paperwork from a storage facility on the edge of town. All of his and Daniela's belongings had been packed away and placed in a storage unit, prepaid for exactly 30 days. If the balance was not covered after that, everything inside would be sold at auction. He sat down right there on the hot concrete sidewalk, holding a key to a life he could no longer afford to keep, finally understanding that this was the true cost of the choices he had made. That evening on my balcony, I thought about the envelope, the silver key, the entire quiet machinery of consequence that had simply been allowed to run its natural course. I felt no urge to call him. I felt no urge to fix anything. The lesson had finally been delivered. If you believe some lessons can only be learned the hard way, let me know in the comments, because we are almost at the end of Christopher's story. Diane operates her law office from the 40th floor of a downtown building, a space built to feel calm, cold, and absolutely serious. She called me that evening to describe a meeting that had taken place that afternoon, and I could picture every second of it clearly in my mind. Somehow, Christopher had convinced Danielle to meet him there, likely promising her that my lawyer was holding a large trust fund from the sale of the house, and that all they needed to do was demand it. Danielle, always drawn to the promise of money, convinced her parents to drive her downtown for one final attempt at a payout. They arrived acting as though they owned the building, Christopher still wearing his torn, dirty clothes from the fence, looking completely unraveled. Danielle demanded to see Diane immediately, threatening legal action if she was not given access right away. Diane calmly led them into a quiet conference room and offered them water, which they refused. Christopher slammed his hands on the table and accused me of losing my mind, of illegally taking a home that rightfully belonged to him. He listed everything: the ruined cruise, the canceled cards, the missing truck, painting himself as the victim of a cruel and sudden attack. Danielle joined in, threatening expensive lawyers her father supposedly had on retainer, demanding immediate access to half of the money from the house sale, speaking with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no in her life. Diane let them speak until they had exhausted every single threat. Then, calmly, she informed them they had absolutely no legal claim to a single penny. The house belonged solely to me. As unpaying guests, they had no tenant rights, no legal equity, nothing. Christopher, red-faced and desperate, insisted he was still my only son and rightful heir, that one day the estate would naturally come to him regardless of what had just happened. He demanded to know the status of his inheritance. Diane reached down and lifted a thick leather binder onto the table, the sound echoing sharply through the quiet room. She explained, calmly and without a trace of emotion, that this binder held the complete financial record of everything I had quietly paid for over the last several years: the truck payments, the insurance premiums, the credit card bailouts, the countless small comforts Danielle had never once questioned. Page after page, she read the numbers aloud, watching Daniela's confident posture slowly collapse as she realized the successful husband she had bragged about to her friends had actually been living entirely on his mother's quiet support. Finally, Diane slid a single page across the table, the final total printed boldly at the bottom, a staggering number representing years of unearned comfort. She explained that this was not a bill. I did not want their money, because I already knew they had none left to give. It was simply a receipt, closing out the relationship for good. Then came the final blow. Diane explained that earlier that morning, I had officially and permanently placed the majority of my estate into an irrevocable charitable trust. Christopher had been formally and legally disinherited, the language carefully written so it could never be challenged or reversed. The money was gone from his future entirely, designated instead for local schools and community programs. Christopher sat frozen, completely shattered, realizing he had traded away a lifetime of security for one cruise and a moment of approval from people who now looked at him with pure disgust. Diane stood, straightened her jacket, and calmly told them the meeting was over, that they had no legal standing and no reason to ever contact me or her office again. The heavy glass doors closed behind them with a quiet, final click. Out in the lobby, Danielle turned on him completely, exposing the truth of his financial dependence in front of her stunned parents. Her father called him a complete failure and warned him never to contact their family again. Danielle told him she would be seeing a divorce attorney immediately, then walked away with her parents into a waiting elevator, leaving Christopher standing utterly alone in an empty marble lobby, holding nothing but a single silver key in his pocket. Late that afternoon, I walked barefoot along the shoreline near my new home, the wet sand cool beneath my feet, the sound of the waves washing gently over every worry I had carried for years. For so long, I believed being a good mother meant absorbing every hit, so my son would never have to feel pain. I carried his debts, his choices, his desperate need to impress people who never once respected either of us. I carried that weight until I forgot what it felt like to simply stand up straight. Today, my shoulders finally felt light. My phone buzzed gently with a message from Diane. Matter concluded, it read. The meeting had ended. Christopher had been formally disinherited. There would be no further contact, no legal recourse, nothing left to fight over. I read it twice, letting the reality settle fully into my heart. The trap had closed. The illusion he built his entire life around had finally shattered. He was standing in the real world now, completely on his own, and I had simply stepped aside and allowed the natural consequences of his choices to unfold. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was only a quiet, complete correction to something that had been broken for a very long time. I pulled my phone from my pocket, looked at the dark screen for a long moment, and powered it off completely, knowing I would never again have to see another desperate, demanding message from my son. I looked out at the wide, endless ocean stretching toward the horizon, representing every possibility still ahead of me. A genuine smile crossed my face as I turned away from the past and walked forward along the shore, belonging to no one but myself. The lesson in all of this is simple. Unconditional love should never mean unconditional financial rescue. When we constantly shield the people we love from the consequences of their own choices, we do not protect them. We quietly stop them from ever becoming who they are capable of being. Respect cannot be bought with a cosign lease or a paid-off vacation. It has to be built honestly, with mutual care and real boundaries. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and even for the people who hurt you, is simply step back and let reality do what you have spent years trying to prevent. If you have ever had to protect your own peace by setting a hard boundary with someone you love, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your worth.